Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Santiago Caro Wash Process Colombia from Sey Coffee. And there's the box right there. And Sey, based out of Brooklyn, New York. And this is the first of two coffees from our brand new Coffee of the Month series, in which we notify you guys of a coffee that we will be working on, giving you the opportunity to purchase it and try it alongside us. And the main reason for purchasing this coffee is the variety, as this coffee has the Chirroso variety, which was one of the most discussed varieties of 2022, and a variety I'm hoping to review a lot more of here in 2023. So I'm looking forward to discussing our first of it here in 2023, as this right here is day 34. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, Sey is notorious for roasting really light. However, they have recently added a little bit more development to the profile of their coffees, and this one right here is in line with that, as it's not necessarily the lightest cup of coffee we've ever had from Sey, but still by most standards and metrics, it's on that moderately light side of things, as it is quite a light cup of coffee still. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. And day 14, first impression, and the first takeaway I had was that it was a little bit more sweet and tropical than I was initially expecting. And even though it has a lot of tropical notes listed on this coffee, even then it just had a bit more of the sweeter citric aspect than I traditionally experienced from Sey's coffees, especially in the earlier days. There was a slight herbal aspect present in it as well, and to be honest, it reminded me of some vintage Sey coffees, as there was an added bit of brightness present within the cup, in addition to that, this kind of zesty component. But all of these factors really did leave a positive first impression, as I think the added bit of sweetness was a nice positive first start. Day 17, ran it through the V60, and on this day it was a little bit more reminiscent of orange juice for me, as there was a fair bit of brightness and sweetness to the cup that honestly just reminded me of high C, and that was another nice benefit to it, because the cup for the most part had this kind of desserty quality to it, a little bit more sweetness than I probably could have expected for a Sey coffee, so this was another positive day for this one. Day 19. Ran it through the April dripper, and while the cup does remain citric forward in a sweet but not overly bright manner, it did provide a little bit more depth to the cup in general, as there was this honey florality aspect present within the cup too, and the listed chocolate was the most pronounced that had been up to this point, and I originally took this as being attributed to the brew method that we utilized. However, the future notes will kind of demonstrate that that was just with a little bit of added rest to the cup, as it does seem to open up a little bit on the cool down, and this cup felt a little bit different, but the future notes will kind of demonstrate that that was just the way the coffee was trending. Day 22, first asterisk we have because I was sick when making these notes, and I attempted Sey's recipe with the Chemex, and it did have the same sweeter citric aspect, as it was skewing a little bit more on the chocolate side of things as well. So that was the big takeaway I had, was I'm getting a little bit more of those characteristics we had experienced from the April dripper here on this day, because in addition to that, there was some more of that kind of floral honey aspect that was present within the cup, not quite as sweet and pronounced as it was through the April dripper, but even then it was adding a little bit of depth to the cup. Day 25, another asterisk, as I was sick on this day as well. Attempted Sey's recipe with the V60, and it was coming out a little different with a little bit of a honeysuckle-like aspect to it. Yet again, I'm really focusing on this note because it was kind of contrasting to the notes that they had listed for this coffee. Tropicality did feel slightly more well-rounded with a bit of the brighter citric aspect still present. It is also delicate in terms of that complementary chocolate components to it. So I'm starting to see just a little bit more of the notes that they have listed on here lining up with my own experiences. And on day 27, the cup became the most flavorful it had been up to this point, with the previously mentioned honeysuckle-like aspect complementing a very sweet citric component. Cup in general has increased greatly in terms of the sweetness and a sweeter chocolate-like base that at this moment was a lot more reminiscent of what I would describe as a Hershey's chocolate bar to me. Day 29, the cup does continue to improve, as it's very citric, sweet, and bright. Immediately at the forefront of the cup, there's a very tropical component, and it does settle off into a pretty well-structured chocolate base. Best day of the coffee to this point. This coffee felt like it was trending in a positive direction. Day 32, the cup didn't feel quite as sweet, as it was a little bit more citric forward today, leaning a little bit into the citric bitterness for me. Cup does feel pretty bright in general with the chocolate base, very well structured, but the brightness did increase a little bit on the cool down, and that's the experience I'm getting here on day 34, is that the citric components do start becoming a little bit more pronounced and a little bit more dominant in the cup in general. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick, and that is the citrus fruit at a level 5. And I think for the entire time I was going through the notes of this coffee, I didn't necessarily see it at that level 5 mark, but when we did make the tasting wheel there on day 32, there was a lot of the citric aspects very pronounced within the cup. And I think for that reason, especially given how strong it was on the cool down, it did justify the lower side of the level 5, especially given that it was on the higher side of the level 4 for the majority of the time I was drinking this coffee. So I can see it definitely still on the lower side, but I think it warranted a level 5 for me. And then we have a bunch of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness. Level 4. It's a washed Colombian coffee. That's always going to be expected. What you're going to get in this tasting wheel. But I think one thing I had to add to that was the chocolate base was very well defined to the cup. So I think that did add to it. But even then, it's very much in line with that level 4. Finish. Level 4. Yes, even with a very strong citric component to the cup, it wasn't overbearing in any sense. So it felt perfect there at that level 4 mark. Sweetness, level 4. That's probably the best thing I have to say about this coffee, is that it did come out a lot sweeter than I might have expected. Sometimes Sey's coffees can come out a little too citric and a little too bright for me, and as a result it sacrifices some of the sweetness that you can get from the cup. So having that there at that level 4, especially a justified level 4, I felt like it was one of the better attributes of this coffee. Acidity, level 4. That's something I just mentioned, as sometimes Sey's coffees can be a little too bright. This one right here did a very good job of kind of balancing the brightness within the cup, because it was right there equal to the sweetness present within it. So having those two things at an equal measure, especially for their coffee, is a nice little point for me. And then we have a couple of level 3s. We skipped the chocolate. Chocolate level 4, yes, very much, and a very well structured chocolate. Very much reminded me of Hershey's, so that was one aspect I liked about this coffee too. And then the level 3s, we'll start with the florality, level 3. And I did mention there were times I was getting this maybe a little bit more subtle honeysuckle-like aspect, but there was a kind of sweeter honey present within this coffee. So that's why I felt like the florality did justify that level 3 mark. Bitterness, level 3, towards the end, as I kind of mentioned, it was a little bit more of a bitter citric component to the cup, as opposed to the maybe slightly sweeter from earlier days. But even then, yeah, it was much more present on the later days. Most of the time I would have it at a 2 on this tasting wheel. And the last thing, body, level 3. If anything, I'm probably a little surprised that the body wasn't higher, but for the most part, it just kind of had a medium-bodied profile to the cup. Not too much to say on that, but yeah, I think for the most part, this is a pretty accurate representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I actually quite like this one. So this isn't going to be a coffee that I will come back to towards the end of the year and be like, this was one of my favorite coffees that I had of the entire year. But in terms of what I've had recently from Sey, I would say this is one that I've enjoyed from them a lot more than a lot of the ones that I actually have had recently. So for that reason, I feel like there's some merit to kind of prioritizing and focusing on this variety, because this coffee, if I were to buy it without looking at the flavor notes, I would assume that this coffee would be something that I would very much enjoy. But if I were to buy it while looking at the flavor notes, I would say this probably isn't going to be my type of coffee, as I'm not the biggest fan of citrus, not the biggest fan of chocolate. But given that Sey made me enjoy this coffee more than I've enjoyed maybe coffees from them that have sounded a little bit more like my flavor profile, this goes to show the importance of maybe picking out a coffee because of the variety as opposed to the flavor notes that are listed, because this one right here had a lot of positive aspects to me. Great cleanliness, great structure, great sweetness, and even a slight bit of florality that I wasn't initially expecting going into it. So for that reason, I feel like this was a nice pick. I'm definitely going to try as many of their Chiroso varieties as they do release this year, so this one was a nice one to kind of start out with. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, obviously still keep in mind Sey's lighter profiles to their coffees, because this one right here is still pretty light in general. And for that reason, you're getting a lot of the citric aspects to it, so you really have to hone in and focus on your citric components to it. But in addition to that, it did have a well-structured chocolate that I don't want to kind of underemphasize, because that part right there was really well done. So a couple of those two things together, it does give it a little bit of a kind of traditional Colombian sense with that lighter profile to it. So that does have some really nice positives to it, and kind of the best way I can point somebody towards for this coffee. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. I know a fair bit of you guys have had an opportunity to try this coffee, so I would love to know all of your thoughts and impressions of this one. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Santiago Caro Wash Process Colombia from Sey Coffee. Thank you for watching.